Good evening, everybody, and welcome. We'll get started with our program in just a minute. We'll give a few people a minute or two to just take their virtual seats. Good evening and welcome to your library, albeit virtually. I'm David Leonard, President of the Boston Public Library, and it is my pleasure and privilege to welcome you and to just give a few words of welcome to our guests this evening. This program is being recorded and broadcast live on our YouTube channel and will be available for viewing later as well. We are thrilled to be presenting tonight's program in conjunction with the City of Boston Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture, and I bring greetings from the Chief of Arts and Culture, Cara Elliott Ortega. We're also co-presenting tonight with Lesley University, and I will be thrilled to hand off to my friend and colleague, Danielle Legros Georges, who is an educator at Lesley University, and also the former Poet Laureate for the City of Boston. And as you'll hear in a few minutes, also a contributor to tonight's theme. At times of change, at times of trauma, at times of great issues weighing on us, many turn to literature to read or to write. At times, we commit our words to prose. Others commit their words to poetry. And tonight's theme, Revisiting the Elegy in the Black Lives Matter era, allows us to unpack a little bit as to what an elegy is. Danielle, can I turn the program to you?
You can. Thank you, David. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being with us. My name is Danielle Georges. I am the director of the Lesley MFA Program in Creative Writing, and I'm so pleased to be partnering on this event with the Boston Public Library, the Boston Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture, and hosting the editors of Revisiting the Elegy in the Black Lives Matter era. Also really happy to be sharing space with the editors for what I feel will be an important conversation, a necessary conversation grounded in the constructive book they have made. Speaking of which, you can order your very own copy of the book through the Lesley University bookstore. There will be a link in the chat if there isn't one already, along with links to other resources compiled by the editors. So now I would like to introduce Emily Rudder, who will later introduce her colleagues and give background on the book. Emily Ruth Rutter is an associate professor of English at Ball State University. She's the author of Invisible Ball of Dreams, Literary Representations of Baseball Behind the Color Line, published by the University Press of Mississippi. The Blues Muse, Race, Gender, and Musical Celebrity in American Poetry, published by the University of Alabama Press, and the forthcoming Black Celebrity, Contemporary Representations of Postbellum Athletes and Artists, which will be published by the University of Delaware Press in 2022. Emily Rudder.
Thanks so much, Danielle, and thanks to the Boston Public Library and to Lesley University and to the Mayor's Office. It's really wonderful to be here with everyone tonight. It's an honor. I'm going to give you some context about our book, Revisiting the Elegy in the Black Lives Matter era, and then we'll segue into a poetry reading. So I'm just going to give you a little background here. So I began working on this volume a few years ago in fall 2017 with the poet scholar Tiffany Austin. And then the book came out this past January 2020. And the idea for the volume really grew out of this interest that Tiffany and I had in the recent outpouring of Black elegies, or poems of grief or mourning. Tiffany and I were interested in exploring the ways in which these poems defied the conventional elegiac turn towards consolation or reconciliation. Instead, these poems are using the landscape, or the kind of poetic landscape, as a site of resistance to the state-sanctioned killings of Black men, women, and children. Tiffany passed very unexpectedly in June 2018. And in the wake of her passing, Sequoia and Darlene, who were already contributors to the volume, graciously agreed to join me in forging ahead and ensuring that Revisiting the Elegy was also part of Tiffany's artistic legacy. So in this book, we do a lot of things in this book. It's a collection of essays and of poetry. We have an interview, we have discussion questions, we have a fantastic appendix, and we're posing a number of questions, and we're kind of ruminating on the nation's inequitable state of affairs as we turn our attention to this genre that's most associated with mourning, the elegy. So we're raising questions about what kind of elegiac responses are most appropriate to police killings, the surveillance of Black communities, and the slow violence of socioeconomic disparities, among other structural forms of racism. How have and how must contemporary elegists innovate within and against the tradition of elegy to account for bodies deemed disposable by the state? In what ways does the elegiac mode facilitate healing, helping us to cope with, meditate on, and work to build healthy, sustainable futures informed by this systemic pattern of loss? And how do we productively interweave theoretical and personal accounts to encourage discussions about art and activism that transgress disciplinary boundaries? Ultimately, what role does elegiac writing play in both the political movements for and personal commitments to Black lives? So these are the questions that really animate our work. And I want to give you an example, and I know the other poets here tonight will give you many examples, but I want to read one of Tiffany's poems that's included in the volume. The poem's called Peaches, and Tiffany included a kind of explanatory note, and the note reads that there's a moment in Stanley Nelson's The Black Panthers documentary when the group surrenders to police, the first being a woman. And there's a story from the Mississippi Delta of two lovers fleeing a sharecropping plantation, being found and lynched. So this is Tiffany Austin, Peaches. I'll go, with my hair under my arms along with the rest underneath my skirt, a shaft. But I'll go after hearing, I don't want to be the first. I don't want death. I want my life. I'm afraid I can't. I'll go because I'm used to going in the dark to an outhouse of living. You have to look closely, even though I'm the one raising something white in my green dress with no sleeves, arms yanked before when they found out I was a woman. I was a different woman in Mississippi, spoken near some man. I said the same to him, I'll go. Because where do you go from land and more land? We can sit on water. We can sleep for a while here. 3 days, then sleep. In my yellow dress, sleep makes the need go away. But to be held in sleep, land under fingers, to be covered by gauze of skunk, no better by nakedness. I was awoken by the name of the place I belonged to. They should have been hunting birds. Instead, they knocked on sleep. No time to pray to that place I belong to. Corkscrews of cock meat, broken yoke. They are somewhere on a plate I can't touch. I can't hear you any longer. The swallowing's gone to Illinois. I'll go, burning in the rain. Beforehand, I was in between beds, between debris, tastes like my lips. He had to watch me being wrenched. It made me mean. Didn't he know I had already smelled him even before? You can smell death coming between his and mine. He knew I'd go. Watching him sweat and moan and not smell. I'm tender there. I'll go because tinder can lay upon tinder. I thought that was a good example of kind of the range of work that we include in this volume. This is a very imagistic kind of paratactic poem, and elegies really come in many forms, as I think you'll hear tonight. Some leave us with a specific call to action. Other times they enjoin us to feel the stakes of loss, while refusing consolation, forgiveness, and amnesia as the expected responses to Black Death. Indeed, if elegy holds the promise of communion with the deceased and of puncturing the boundary, however briefly, between what was and what is, contemporary elegists register further boundary-breaking potential, whereby the possibilities of a more equitable what could be take shape. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Danielle Georges and introduce her properly and give her the floor to read some of her work. So she is a professor of creative writing, the director of Lesley University's MFA Program in creative writing. As you heard, she was appointed Boston's second Poet Laureate, and her work from 2015 to 2019 included collaborations with literary and visual artists, museums, and galleries. Her honors include fellowships from the Massachusetts Cultural Council, the Boston Foundation, the Black Metropolis Research Consortium, and commissions from the trustees of reservations in the Boston Public Library. And of course, she is a contributor to Revisiting the Elegy in the Black Lives Matter era. So I will turn it over to Danielle. Thanks.
Thank you, Emily. I will read 4 poems. The first 2 appear in Revisiting the Elegy, and the last 2 appear in my most recent book of poems. As Falling Star. The impossible task of breathing near guns, breathing and running, breathing and standing as still as death when it closes you off, when it wraps its arms around you. If breathing is living, if breath is spirit, what spirit lifts you off the earth? Death, see yourself here as fear, as falling stripe, as falling star. Poem of history. And I should mention that this poem started out as a ghazal, which is a beautiful Persian form with that's written in couplets with rhyme and repeating words at the ends. And so you'll hear the repetition of a particular word, although as a ghazal, I don't know that I was very successful. Poem of history. When living your life, you're not making history. Stepping out of your life, you make of it history. Jamal, doctoral student whose city apartment I've sublet, has gone this summer to Egypt to write a story which is and is not history. Gone before Egypt exploded in history. Its leader pulled down like a kite by his people. Jamal in the foule, in the crowd, as it opens its flag of history. Not amber, but action. A lamp glowing in shadows of history. Like the light of my lamp on Jamal's table-turned desk on which I write history. His apartment blurs in the heat of summer. White octagonal tiles and a clawfoot tub govern the bathroom. I draw water from the waters of history, cool and safe from the blood of history. I draw water from the sink of the kitchen, cool and clear, for the lilies standing bright as stars on the table by the white wall and window. Outside, the gray buildings past the green plaisance. The university sprawls like a beast. How lovely its lawns, its evening lights, patrolled by dark guards drawn from the dark city periphery. An irony not lost on them. In inky corners posted, shielding the denizens of the university from others like them. Inside and out, the confines of safety, the black jungle, the gray jungle, the towers, the lush avenues, the colossal structures, the sources of knowledge, a dark flower, a guarding of history. These two poems were written in the aftermath of the 2010 earthquake in Haiti. In the next town. What about such gravity makes us want to live? Pulled from the rubble, a woman in ash, a boy who carries his broken-armed sister down a hill. What in us says life, life, life after 20 days entombed, life in the singing at the door, not even a door, the remains, the imprint of a church, the Lord, Jesus, Mother Mary, somehow, all the gods descendant, the gate, the crossroads, and the light. How does a country bury its too hastily buried dead? And this last poem is entitled Intersection. Right after the earthquake, I was asked to write a poem to contribute to a magazine that would go toward relief efforts. And I had a really hard time doing that, given the scale of the loss of life. 200,000 people died in this very, very brief moment. Not unlike what is happening with coronavirus here in the United States. Lives that could have been saved if not for the effects of systemic racism, structural violence, incompetent governance, international intervention in Haitian governmental affairs, poverty. So this is the poem, Intersection. The earth shook, a portal opened. I walked through it. The earth shook, a portal opened. I walked through it. The earth shook, a portal opened. I walked through it. The earth shook, a portal opened. I walked through it. I walked through it. I walked. The earth shook. A portal opened. I walked through it. Ash. The earth shook. A portal opened. I walked through it. Earth. The earth shook. A portal opened. I walked through it. Ash. I walked through it. Ash. I walked through it. Ash. The earth shook. A portal opens. I walk through it. Thank you.
I'm just realizing that we don't have reactions here, but if I had reactions, it would be, where's the snap button on Zoom? We need that, but all of the snaps, and Danielle, thank you so much. That was beautiful. I want to introduce you all now to Sequoia Maner. Sequoia is an assistant professor of English at Spelman College. Her poetry and scholarship have been published in The Feminist Wire, Meridians, Obsidian, The Langston Hughes Review, and elsewhere. And of course, she is a co-editor on Revisiting the Elegy in the Black Lives Matter era. And she's at work on a manuscript regarding the artistry of Kendrick Lamar. So let's welcome Sequoia.
My heart, Danielle, I don't even know how I am supposed to follow that. I am near tears. Your work is so powerful. And I'm just thinking about all of the portals that we're walking through, all of the ash that we are witnessing. Thank you so much. Please get Danielle's books in your lives if you don't have them. I'm going to try to center myself now and read you some poems. I'm hoping to get through 3 poems, but it might only be 2, only because I actually want to tell you a little bit about how I wrote these poems and why I came to them. I'm going to read 2 from the book. The first one is called Boy Contrapuntal, and I can really say that it's the first elegy that I wrote that I recognized as elegy, and I recognized as contributing to a larger tradition. And it sort of set me on a path of obsessing with elegy, quite frankly. And maybe in the Q&A, we can talk about why we're drawn to elegy. But I wrote this upon the acquittal of George Zimmerman for the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. And I will actually share my screen just for this poem because it takes a specific form. It's a contrapuntal, and there are these 2 narratives that are happening, and I'll read one voice, and then I'll read the second voice, and then you'll see I'm going to read both of the voices together, and I think that something happens in that 3rd reading. So let me just see if I can share my screen. Okay. Boy Contrapuntal for Trayvon Martin. I am American first. I have Black friends and race is past. A civic duty, patrolling the block for a thug, performing the ritual again. He kept looking, staring, relentless, and it was raining. There's been a history of Black boys breaking in. They always get away while walking suspiciously tall, talking suspiciously boastful, tasting blood and refusing to call it fear. But I've seen it rise in their eyes. Illegible. We all learn our lessons. Stand ground and walk. First impression, I don't belong here anymore. Past, invisible, odd, I am treated like a thug, a nuisance, suspended again. A walk to clear the brain. It was raining drops weighty as bullets, breaking in the neighborhood. Walking and feeling the need to run. Talking and feeling the need to yell. Tasting something acrid like adrenaline or fear, hidden in hoodies and headphones. A legible body of a man, boy not yet grown. We all learn our lessons. Walk away, refuse the urge to run. I am American. First impression, I don't belong here anymore. I have Black friends and race is past, invisible, odd. I am treated like a civic duty. Patrolling the block for a thug, a nuisance, suspended performing the ritual again. A walk to clear the brain. He kept looking, staring, relentless. It was raining drops weighty as bullets. There's been a history of Black boys breaking in the neighborhood. They always get away while walking and feeling the need to run suspiciously tall, talking and feeling the need to yell suspiciously boastful, tasting something acrid like adrenaline or blood and refusing to call it fear, hidden in hoodies and headphones. But I've seen it rise in their eyes, a legible body of a man, boy not yet grown. We all learn our lessons, stand ground, walk away, refuse the urge to run. And that poem, as Emily was saying in her introduction, is all about the refusal of consolation, not coming to easy conclusions, easy answers. There is no sort of getting outside, right? Do we stand ground? Do we walk away? Do we run? Either of those actions, any of those actions could end in our death, right? The second poem is called Upon Reading the Autopsy of Sandra Bland. And I was living in Austin, Texas for 10 years. Sandra Bland and I were the same age. She was a beautiful woman. The video of her confrontation with officers went viral in a nature that was very arresting for me. It happened on a road that I drive often. I feel like I knew Sandra through her videos. I didn't know her personally, but I felt like I knew her and I felt like I loved her and I feel like I love her. And I'll just say that this poem was written in response to a very famous poet who wrote what I just consider to be a nasty and quite frankly terrible poem about Mike Brown using his autopsy report. So I decided, how can I use the materials of the autopsy report in a way that is not reinscribing the violence, in a way that is not sort of acting in the same role, the same sort of murderous role of the state, How can this poem do something else? So this is called Upon Reading the Autopsy of Sandra Bland. The words of the medical examiner read, "The neck is remarkable for a ligature furrow." And you are unwoven by the combination of these two words, ligature and furrow, because furrow describes a groove or rut in the ground or in the surface of something like tender skin. A furrow is a depression dug out for seeding. How odd, the furrowing, set next to ligature, which derives from the Latin ligare, meaning to tie or bind. The word ligature is tough and flexible, like the larynx. It holds the state of being bound or stiffened, like the body in solitary confinement, like the body in rigor mortis in solitary confinement. It moves beyond the act of binding to capture the thing that performs the act of binding, like a cord or a similar something, like a plastic bag. But the ligature is also thread used in surgery to close a vessel or remove a tumor. And you think about how the body is a vessel and how she had no tumors, how the trachea is an instrument moving currents of air into and out of lungs, how in music a ligature is both the group of notes played as a phrase and the curved line that indicates such a phrase. How remarkable is the spine that is line and curve and holding up all you have ever loved, a single harmonic texture. And you are reminded of how language folds into itself, because the word ligature indicates suspension of intellectual or physical powers, leaves no room for miscarriage or epilepsy or prayer, not to mention how in typography, the ligature is a character that combines multiple letters like the AE in vertebrae, and so many common words once contained space enough for small couplings. Words like economy and hemorrhage and tragedy and fetus and federal, and you wonder if Sandra knew that bound up in her furrowing was a history of how easily the body rends. Thank you. How am I on time? Emily, do I have time for one more? It's a short one.
Yeah, you do.
Thank you. I'll just close with one last one. And so I want to take us a little bit outside. I want to think about the expansiveness of elegy. So I have many elegies for specific victims of police violence, including Natasha McKenna. I'm working on a piece about Breonna Taylor now. That piece has been really difficult for me. But I also tend to write other forms of elegy. So there are these big, phenomenal figures, these celebrity figures in our life that when they pass, we go through a kind of grieving. So figures like Muhammad Ali and Tupac Shakur have been very central in my life. And most recently, the passing of Prince affected me deeply. And I have not been able to write about that until this pandemic. Something happened in this pandemic. So this is one of my Prince poems. I imagine that it will turn into many more, but it is also an elegy of sorts. And it starts with a little epigraph from Prince from my favorite song called Dark off his 1994 album called Come. But the line is, it's a beautiful album, orchestral, pick it up if you don't have it, right? But the line is, how could you leave me, baby? Leave me in the dark. And this is called The Day That Prince Died. The day Prince died, she devolved into muteness, returned to stubborn silence, sucked her thumb, curled into herself, lashed out at anyone bold enough to ask, how are you? She wondered. She danced profusely, returned to her time when her name was Desire, pronounced Desiree, when everything was erotic, when she was beautiful, strange, when they were faggots, when she fainted before the fourth encore and revived by the finale, when he was ageless and she was agile, when they risked it all, leapt with abandon, landed in deep plie, full second, graceful as Alvin Ailey dancers in Revelation. She always landed on her feet. Let the music be her guide to getting off proper. She fucked girls, she fucked guys, liked fucking herself most. Didn't believe in nasty bodies nor sin. Knew her body and what to do. Knew the difference between feel right and feel wrong. Found a creamy center. Said I would die for you. Said nothing compares to you. Said I want to be your lover, baby. Jacked them off proper before putting on her black lipstick. She married a man. She married a woman. She was always alone. She said, I don't understand why you have to hurt me, baby. Hurt me in the dark. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Sequoia. It is such a pleasure to next introduce Darlene Anita Scott. She's a poet, she's a visual artist, and her research explores corporeal performances of trauma and the violence of silence. Her recent poetry has appeared in journals and anthologies, including About Place, Kestrel, The Killens Review, Anti-Heroin Chic, and Furious Flower, Seeding the Future of African-American Poetry. Everybody should have that volume. Her art has been featured in several journals, such as the West Review and the Journal, and has been on exhibit at 150 Franklin Street Gallery and at the Girl Museum, a virtual museum celebrating girls and girlhood. Scott's most recent project is a multimedia exploration, Breathing Lessons, which explores the role of the good girl as it is applied to girls of color. Scott is also, of course, the co-editor of Revisiting the Elegy in the Black Lives Matter era, and the author of Marrow, which is a forthcoming collection of poems reimagining the People's Temple, a radical Christian congregation coerced into suicide by their spiritual leader. So we'll be looking out for that, forthcoming from the University Press of Kentucky in 2021. All right, Darlene.
Hey, everybody. Thank you, Emily, for that introduction. Yeah, I think I'll just get into it because I can't talk. to kind of get into these poems.
I'm actually having a little trouble hearing you. I think maybe just get a little closer to the mic.
Let's see. The mic is on my.
Oh, okay. It's on your person.
Yes, it is.
It was just a blip. Yeah.
Let's try. Okay. Let's see if that's better.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to turn the volume up so I can hear you guys. And so I want to share my screen so that you can follow along with the poems I'm going to read. I'm going to start with a poem about collaborators, in addition to being collaborators, very good friends. And so let's see this slide. And it's about the poem kind of takes on her. It's all in which rainbow appears instead. You can see it on the screen. Here's instead. Fold up one towel into triptychs and use you. Cook some curry and it smell like once. Cast an orange pretty red line and you float into my thoughts, a scattered of the moon seed. Intriguing is the emptiness of a hole in the road that swallowed asphalt overnight. As the leaves that appear from behind you, even though I was late, the transition day. Didn't see it coming, I couldn't see you leaving, so there I was, slurping cowtails, missing you. And sometimes when I'm watching something terrible, reading something ridiculous, listening to downtown explode with all living and people might notice I miss you. I feel like the equation and blunts. Speakers he rented blaring Tevin Campbell over his shame of a failed attempt at kissing me. I missed the boy I wanted to be over this cash lost to my phone with cracks clean before ready to take. I could say send scroll properly and never catch sort. I missed your story that one night because you were on your back, probably under too much stress or in intense talks about the next and last years with a God who only planned for you to be a meteor, a just for a time. I'm sorry, my screen just went out. Okay, it's back.
Darlene, would you mind, do you think you could mute your video? Because you're kind of cutting in and out, so I think it might be a Wi-Fi connection. And the recommendation. So
stop the share screen. So you need me to stop sharing the screen?
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. But it's the Wi-Fi is kind of, we can't really hear you.
Okay. Frustrating. Okay, let's try it again.
Okay.
I'm not gonna start from the beginning so that we can get through the other poems. I'll start with the line, I don't miss your snoring. I don't miss your snoring that one night because you were on your back, probably under too much stress or in intense talks about the next and last years with a God who only planned for you to be here.
Darlene, I think we've kind of lost your connection there. Maybe,
Okay.
I'm so sorry. I don't know what's going on, but we can't really hear you. Maybe if you want to jump off and come back on, that might help. Okay, thanks, Darlene. So while we're giving Darlene a minute, I don't know if there's something else, Sequoia, Danielle, you wanted to read, or we could, yeah.
I can definitely always find more poems to read. You know, I got them. Danielle,
I
how
know
about
you
you?
got them in your back pocket at all times.
Yeah, let me think about which poem. Danielle, you have a poem that you're thinking about too?
Looks like Darlene is also back on. So, Darlene, do you want to try again and see?
I suppose we could try again. Can you hear me now, or is it still cutting out?
It's cutting out a little bit, but I could hear you better.
Okay. Let's try again.
Okay.
I think I'll just read this poem and then we'll stop and get into the Q&A, because
Okay.
I think now that we've taken quite a bit of time. So I'm going to reread the entire poem so that we follow it.
Thank you.
Again, it's in which Tevin Campbell appears instead, and it's an elegy for our co-editor Tiffany Austin, who was obviously one of my collaborators, but also a really close friend. Folded warm towels into triptychs and missed you. Cooked some curry and it smelled like once. Passed an orange cone predicting wrecked alignment, and you float into my thoughts, a scatter of wind-borne seed. Intriguing as the emptiness of the hole in the road that swallowed asphalt overnight. As the new leaf that appeared on my evil day, missing you. Didn't see it coming like I couldn't see your leaving coming. So there I was, slurping cowtails, missing you. And sometimes when I'm watching something terrible, reading something ridiculous, listening to downtown explode with all its living and people not even noticing, I miss you. I miss you like the quadratic equation I learned in 6th or 7th grade, as unsure if this is how it works. Only you know I was unimpressed by a boy who offered Pepsi and blunts. Speakers he rented blaring Tevin Campbell over his shame of a failed attempt at kissing me. I missed the boy I wanted to be over, and this one's awkward. There's no way I should miss you like that. Selfish, unearned, insipid grief. I want to be bigger or disappear. It is a blink, this missing you. A cache of pictures we took at Venice Beach, lost to a waterlogged phone with its cracked screen, reordering the take. I could save, send, scroll the prophecy, and never catch its portent. I don't miss your snoring that one night because you were on your back, probably under too much stress, or in intense talks about the next and last years with a God who only planned for you to be a meteor, a just for a time. Aren't we all? But not so fast, you must have lectured, which I wouldn't have known to treasure as the gift of your breath. So I plugged my ears with slow music, probably some Tevin Campbell. I have missed you for what seems like eternity and feels like the first day after. And I'm told it will be this way. Now I'm dripping orange juice on the counter, missing you. Pulp and salt will linger through the day while I make the commute of terrible mergers and Sunday drivers wrecking rush hour, while I forget how much I miss you. For entire moments, sometimes whole days will not miss you at all, until I'm washing my hair, or it's the 3rd Tuesday of the 2nd week of a month in the year around 6/13. while I'm rinsing remnants of curry from my favorite pot. Will miss you like I shouldn't. Stealth grief growing before my compromised eyes, searching for Tevin's tomorrow, light in a place where there's none. Then boom, bud to full grown, purple creeping everywhere.
Darlene, that was beautiful and so powerful.
Thank you.
We definitely have time for another one you sound great. So if you have another one you'd like to read.
Okay, that kind of threw me off. I'd like to read then at least one of the poems from the collection. So in the collection, I wrote A Crown of Sonnets, and A Crown of Sonnets, if you're not familiar, is comprised of a series of 15 sonnets. The first 14 of those sonnets use the last line of the previous sonnet as the first line of the subsequent sonnet, and then the 15th sonnet, the last one, is comprised of all of those last lines. So that series was called A Series of Survivals, and you probably could kind of hear from the other poem that one of the things I'm really interested in is how we survive, how we move beyond that consolation part of the elegy. So this is number 3 from A Series of Survivals. To feel and be felt surely will unmake the night of your skin is. Fill your inbox with clumsy, tender imagery, cook meals like spaghetti. He says he has more, but he doesn't, and you both know it. Neither of you know where you are going from here. Neither of you can watch the news without wincing, go breathy and handsy to manufacture what feels like it's disappearing, fast as the space between the first handshake and the sheets. Here you are, lifetime in a nighttime, he decreed. You dare the prophecy. Collect your things until again is a groove and you lose grounds for an objection. You hold on to each other like fear, release with the same verb. Every time he collects your hair in his hands, buries his nose in it as if to suffocate himself into the night. Let's, in the morning, you challenge. Why say there is always morning when it's not true? And so it comes, morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Darlene. That was beautiful. All right, well, I think we're going to transition into a few questions, kind of a moderated discussion, and then we'd like to hear some questions from the audience. So if you have questions that you'd like to ask our readers, please put them in the Q&A using the Q&A button, and we'll get to them in a few minutes. The first question I'd like to pose to you all is, what compels your elegiac voice, or how do you see yourself kind of entering into conversations about elegy? So maybe we'll just go in the order of the readers. Danielle, do you want to start?
Sure. What compels my elegiac voice? Outrage, sorrow, love for people like Tamir Rice and Breonna Taylor. I'm echoing Sequoia, Sandra Bland, Amadou Diallo, who could be my siblings or my children or my relatives who look like me, and I presume have experiences not dissimilar to mine, being a person of color, being a Black person in the United States, walking the earth. And so, you know, I think about how expansively folks in BIPOC communities think of family. And so I feel there are connections. I feel I have connections to these individuals. And we are connected. And so it's a way to see these people and to elevate folks who, as individuals, but also who have lost their lives to white supremacy in the United States here, you know, and to sort of remove them from their from a position in which we know them only through their deaths, right? So to sort of to return some subjectivity to them in a system that would seek to have them operate as objects, right? And inhuman, to return subjectivity to the beloved, and to have that act sort of belong to a community as well. So there's sort of addressing the individual and the community too. So I think, I think I'll stop there.
Yeah.
I'm just
Sequoia?
going to echo everything that Danielle has said, like where you started, yes, outrage, sadness, and then those important parts, joy, love, right? I think that so much of my elegies are compelled, exactly as you said, this sort of collective sense of kinship and family, this deep love that wells, from inside me. I think that I have this desire to really bear witness to this time. There is so much that is happening. Our planet is dying before our very eyes, People close to us that we love are dying. There are these institutions, these like structural institutions that are squeezing the life out of our communities, right? And there is a part of me that says, this future that we are striving for, which I deeply believe that we can create, that we can imagine and create and work and get there. I want whoever might find one of my little poems somewhere, right, to know that I survived this, and that I loved through it. I think that narratives are so easy. I mean, we're kind of living in a time in this campaign of disinformation that surrounds us. We're seeing how easily narratives can be unwritten or rewritten or retold from a certain perspective or biased or, and I want to document the narrative, the way that I saw it, the way that I lived it, the things that I know, and so much of my elegies are, I don't know if you could hear it in the poems, but really I do a lot of research, like a lot of research, going through public documents, finding what I can from the victims themselves, also the people that love them. And not all of that makes it into it, but I'm really interested in like the facts of it. I'm interested in how poetry can move beyond the facts, but also like reiterate what the facts are. Like I think about that Trayvon Martin poem. And for me, that was really an examination. And I wrote that after going through like tons of court testimonies and reading all of like the crazy sort of mythologies that were being written about Trayvon Martin at that time. Sitting through, it came after a lot of research. And I think about how I was really interested in that moment of contact between two individuals and the kind of murderous spark that could erupt there, right? Like this very intimate moment that no one was talking about. I'm like, what about the fear that this little boy, in my mind, he's a little boy, Trayvon Martin, the 17-year-old boy must have felt like a hunted individual. That's a thing that we have to face and confront and talk about. So I think that the last thing that I'll say is that I think that elegy for me has been a really long project that I've come into. Some of my earliest memories growing up in Los Angeles are the 1992 riots, right? And how that is sparked around a brutalized body, right? I think about how I came into my activism through Hurricane Katrina while I was in college, and how that so much of the discourse at that time was around the spectacle of disenfranchised Black bodies, the spectacle of poverty and criminalization. And so this has been building for me for a long time. So I think that, my interest in elegy is also deeply connected to my interest in history and telling a narrative like it can only be told from, you know, the people that have lived it, in a sense. Okay, I'll stop there.
I'm thinking about that James Baldwin quote about poets are the only ones that tell the truth. Darlene, what compels your elegiac voice?
I think similar to Sequoia, the bearing witness piece is really important to me, and the recording of history as it's happening. So one thing Sequoia just made reference to was 1992, the riots of 1992. And in 92, I remember I was not in LA. I was on the East Coast, but I remember those riots. But what I really remember was the death of Latasha Harlins. That was part of what prompted them, and ended up writing Elegy about that, about her death, and about what I felt like at 15, being alive, and someone who was the same age as me not being alive anymore, and what that meant for me in the time. So I think in addition to bearing witness, what I find myself trying to do with Elegy is make sense, probably trying to do with all of my writing, is trying to make sense of things, trying to figure out, like I was trying to figure out why. I understood to some degree why that was so important to me as an adult. At 15, I didn't necessarily understand why that was so significant to me. Why someone on the West Coast, a young lady on the West Coast who had passed away, who had been murdered, not passed away, who had been murdered, why that was so significant to me, and particularly as an adult when I eventually wrote the poem, how that became a red flag on my of memory. And obviously, those red flags that are our memories also become markers for how we present ourselves in the world, I believe. So they become, there's a book called The Body Keeps the Score, right? And our bodies hold on to these traumatic events, and they start to present in ways that remember those traumatic events. And that, for me, that's just one of them. I've been considering recently, a lot of events recently, the city of Philadelphia issued a formal apology for the bombing of the house, of the Move house. Move was a radical Africanized group of people, residents of this Osage Avenue. I remember that very clearly. We watched it on the news. And I was thinking about events like that, about the death, like the death of Latasha Harlins, like the bombing of the Move house, and how they have influenced so much of my life, while they weren't necessarily specific to my life, if that makes any sense, right? And so yeah, I would say the bearing witness piece probably is what most compels it, and that compels that voice. And then trying to make sense of what those things mean for me personally, how I present in the world to this day as those events happen.
Yeah, that's so helpful. Yeah, you're just making me think about so many things about how the circumstances of death say so much about, inequities, say so much about the violence of the state, say so much about different levels of citizenship. There's so much to elaborate on there, but thanks for that, Darlene. So maybe we could talk a little bit about, the work that you all do as educators, or have done as educators, and kind of how the campus or the classroom kind of plays a role in maybe an elegy, but also just in, all of your work, and certainly the work of the volume. It's very connected to the movement for Black Lives. And so how do you see your work or your role, like as an educator, kind of being connected to that kind of commitment to the movement? And I guess we can go in the same order. We'll start with Danielle.
The educational philosopher John Dewey understood education as a process of living, and not a preparation for future living. Right? and felt that school must represent real life, and also that schools are primarily social institutions. You know, if we accept that premise, then we have to believe that issues that occur in the world must have a place in our classrooms and on our campuses. And I feel that the Black Lives movement is forcing us to consider that question, and also forcing us to consider an ethics of care vis-a-vis the educational endeavor, right? What does it mean for us educators, teachers, to care about students, and what are the components of that care? And dialogue is really, really important. And I think Black Lives Matter has forced certain dialogues, as have student movements prior to Black Lives Matter. Civil rights, certainly, as an example. So I feel that, so not only is the movement forcing institutions to consider their roles in white supremacy, I mean, to be blunt, and its perpetuation. But it's also forcing us educators to see how we might be complicit too, right? Especially those of us who have privilege. And we, you know, as a professor, I acknowledge that I have a certain amount of privilege, right? And so what do I do with that, right? And how do I create curriculum and engage in pedagogy that is meaningful and responds to the very significant questions that are being posed to us by Black Lives Matter activists, who are also students, who are in the world, and people who are engaged in anti-racist work.
Yeah, absolutely. Retweet everything you just said. Sequoia?
Exactly. I keep finding myself in the position of having to follow Danielle, and I just want to echo everything that she has said. Yes, yes, yes. I think I also approach this question in a slightly different way. And I think about how one of the beautiful things about the movement for Black lives is that while at the center, the institution of policing is the thing that must be fundamentally dismantled and reimagined, that dismantling involves a host of other institutions, right? If we're going to talk about police, we also have to talk about our healthcare system, right? If we're going to talk about police, we also have to talk about our political system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things that I found about having this dialogue about Black Lives Matter in the classroom is that, one, I'm attracting students from all over the campus, right? That might not have necessarily taken African-American literature courses, might not have taken English courses, which is the discipline I teach in. But they're asking these questions and they're interested and they want to know, right? And that's beautiful. So I really encourage folks, you know, I'm a firm believer. I fundamentally believe that we are all endowed with gifts and talents, and that when we use those talents in our respective fields, right? You might be in healthcare, you might be in publishing, you might be a student, you might be in politics, wherever you are, you know, like when we combine those talents to make, you know, a cohesive wave of power, that's something to be scared of, quite frankly, and in a beautiful way, right? It's tremendous. So I'm really inspired by the ways that I see the movement for Black lives taken up on campuses. However, in saying that, I also firmly believe that, you know, the university is a very privileged space. I know that the 15 to 25 students that I have in my class at Spelman College worked very hard to get there, but are also very lucky, right? And for every student in that class, there are dozens more who will not make it into that space, right? Will not make it into in a college space, but they also too have these same questions. I believe that classrooms can happen anywhere, right? They happen at our public libraries. You know, just a little bit story, and then I'll promise I'll stop so Darlene can say something. But I was just in the neighborhood the other day. There was a security guard. We were talking. He was like, "Oh, you teach English," and he's telling me how difficult that was for him as a subject in school. And then we started talking about the subject matter of what I'm teaching, about Black Lives Matter. We started having that conversation. All of a sudden, it was a classroom. He was teaching me things, and I was teaching him things, right? So I believe you know, that the work not only has to take place inside the ivory tower, it has to happen on the streets too. It has to happen in our churches, all of those spaces, around the table at Thanksgiving, all of those spaces, right? Yeah. Can I just say the last thing I'll add is that I think that we can't forget that we really are in an age where disinformation and propaganda is a very real thing. I don't think that we can forget that Donald Trump just this year, right, our outgoing president, made it his mission to criminalize and scandalize what he calls critical race theory, right, on college campuses, right? And that is an attempt to shut down certain narratives about white supremacy, about power, et cetera, et cetera. And we can't forget that 72 million people voted for him, right? Mm-hmm. Even though he will not be coming back into the White House, 72 million people voted for him, right? Mm-hmm. And that means something. So, yeah.
Absolutely. It means we have to be ever vigilant. Darlene, what were you thinking about those connections?
Yeah, I haven't been in the classroom for about a year. And so, but, you know, I have been an educator for 20 years. Mm-hmm. And so you kind of don't lose it, right? Yeah, like I just heard from a student that I taught the first class I had as a full professor, not as a graduate teaching assistant. He was in a freshman class, and I just heard from him the other day, and it's literally been 20 years. So that was, you know, amazing. Refreshing, to say the least. In any case, I bring him up in part to talk about like how I suppose I never thought of my work as an educator as being an activist, but I do recognize that the work I do is part of activism. With this young man, most of my students were and have been at the universities I've taught, first generation. While the university, like we just said, like Danielle pointed out and Sequoia pointed out, are sites of privilege typically. And I don't take that away from them. Those students were coming, as Sequoia said, like the students who come to Spelman, they worked hard, they got a spot at Spelman. A lot of students won't. And that right there affords them a certain amount of privilege, whether they come from privilege or not. But this young man comes from what we would consider not a privileged background, first generation student, immigrant, and so forth. And when he was about to graduate, I had moved on by then. So he was in a freshman class I was teaching, and his family could not come to the graduation. So he invited me, and I couldn't come because I was out of town. But I gave him the book, "Oh, the Places You'll Go" by Dr. Seuss, right? It's pretty popular to give this gift for graduation. And he said, "Miss Scott, this is funny, and this is so like you to give me a children's book," you know? And I was like, well, yeah, but you'll see in a few years that this book is going to be significant to you. So when he wrote me back, he said, you know, I still have that book and I still read it. And I've been traveling a lot, very literal interpretation, right, of "Oh, the Places You'll Go," but also very critical to me at the time and even now to think about how I enter into that space, I think Danielle was saying this, how we go into the space to teach. What does it look like to care about our students? And I think that is part of activism. The other part, I think, is to encourage my students to think. So, of course, he looks at a children's book and he says, "What's this even mean? You know, this is a joke, right? This is funny." And I was like, no, I promise it's not funny. And I wrote him a note and kind of explained. But I also knew that it would be over time that he would come to that understanding, or come to a place where he started to see the significance of the text. And so part of my caring for students is caring about their thinking and caring about them practicing that, not what they think, but rather that they're actively practicing that. So yeah, I think I come to the classroom, have come to the classroom in two ways. The first way is that I genuinely care. That's why I'm there. Otherwise, I would figure out something else to do with my life, with my career path. And the second part is that active, I think Danielle was referring to it when she was talking about Dewey, that they're actively thinking, that they're actively engaged in that process. And wherever they come to after they start to participate in that process is going to be far better than if they don't. And so it's not up to me to decide or to determine or to give them what to think, but rather to get them in the practice of actively thinking, right? And so hopefully we won't see some of the things that we've seen in the news, as Sequoia referred to, with the elections, with the recent elections and so forth.
Yeah, that's really helpful. It looks like, I'm not sure if we have any questions yet in the Q&A, but audience members, we have a little more time, so we would love to hear your questions. If you have a question, go ahead and put it in there, and we have a few minutes to think it through. I don't know if you all have other thoughts about kind of, you know, how the work that we're engaged in it sort of contributes to or furthers the movement for Black lives, or like where we go from here. You know, I really appreciated everything that you all were saying. I mean, I think that like one thing that sort of stood out to me, and certainly this is something that I think about a lot and have been thinking about a lot, is just that there is no like separation between this work that we're doing in this volume and this work that I'm doing in the classroom, or, you know, activist work, or, you know, all of my various endeavors. Like, it's all part of the work. And I think there oftentimes is this perception that like, this is sort of what I do, and then there's a sort of other thing. And I know that kind of breaking that down to say, you know, breaking those boundaries down, or those barriers down, or that false sense that somehow you can sort of be dismantling white supremacy in your writing, but not in other aspects of your life. That's certainly something that, you know, I've grappled with a lot, and have been just trying to ensure that, you know, anti-racism is a part of like every moment. So I don't know if others have thoughts about that while we have a few more minutes.
I think, Emily, if I understood, you're asking like how we do this work across across our lives, like across the various aspects of our lives.
Yeah, thanks, Darlene. I didn't really ask a question, so I appreciate you reading my mind.
But yeah, I get what you're saying. I've had this conversation with my mother about what we call playing your position. So wherever you are in your life. So one of the things that I think about, like my mother, so I'm one of 5 girls. I have a twin sister and 3 older sisters. And we're kind of stair steps. So that means that there were 5 girls in the house at the same time, and, you know, and all that comes with that. And my mother, and my father too, but speaking of my mother was very much a mother, you know, like very mothering. And so, so my mother, when we were talking about what I do, and I don't have children, I have my students, and my mother has us, and then a lot of cousins too. And her position was the same thing, really. Like, we were doing the same thing, but we were doing them in different places. So we talk about playing our positions. Like, what does it look like to be an activist as a mother? Do you have to go and carry a sign and go to the protest? And no, I don't think so. But the things that she taught us, the way that she socialized us and so forth, has everything to do with who I am in the classroom and outside of the classroom and otherwise. So I was telling her, I think of my students as, and probably all educators would think this way, I think of my students as whatever that I'm doing in that classroom is what they're going to become: parents, politicians, doctors, educators, engineers. And so the things that are happening in my position, like, I'm not going to be the engineer and I'm not going to be the parent, but in any case, it is really important that we're very intentional in whatever position we're placed in, I think. And so, like you said, that translates into my classroom, certainly, but also into my art, into how I play auntie, but in all those roles.
Yeah, that's so helpful. I want to, I don't want to cut Sequoia and Danielle off from answering this question, but we do have a question from Vicky about power and elegy. What power do you feel elegies have to help mourners heal? And I think that's such an important question. I think we've been talking a lot about elegies and activism, elegies and resistance, but what is this kind of, what is the role of elegy in healing and coping? Sequoia, you want to start? And Danielle, you want to go after?
Yeah, it's a big question, but it's such an important question. I think that it happens at several levels. I know that I personally write elegies to participate in a process of healing for myself. And I also know that an elegy is successful when, I don't even know how to explain this. It's a visceral thing. I think that something happens to the body. I'm thinking about that Sandra Bland poem in particular. And for me, that's a poem about breath, about the violation that is taking someone's breath. But also in the reading, I wanted it to be clear. I wanted it to be a search for breath, if this makes sense for the reader, right? I wanted the reader to be able to find their breath by the end of the poem, right? To be aware of their breath, to be aware of their body. And I think about how some of the most impactful elegies for me are the ones that sort of resonate and vibrate within my body. And that kind of resonance and vibration gives me the will to endure, gives me the will to go on. So I think about Ross Gay's beautiful elegy for Mike Brown. That poem does something to me viscerally, right? I think about Robert Hayden's elegy for Frederick Douglass. That's a poem that moves me, and it's a poem that I return to again and again when I need something, when I need that intangible something, when there's unrest in my spirit. I think that a poem can settle us, a poem can see us, right? A poem can affirm us. A poem can speak to us in a language that goes beyond the language, right? It's also about the rhythm, the sound. I deeply believe in the healing powers of poetry. I don't know if that was if that made sense. What about you guys, Danielle and Darlene?
I echo what Sequoia has said. The power elegy has for the mourner. I think the elegy taps into old traditions of dealing with and addressing and discussing and naming death, especially in our society in the United States, which seeks to, I think, historically separate us from death, right? To keep death afar, to subcontract death to others. And the elegy creates this space in which we are confronted with death and require time to read and ingest the poem as part of this larger space in which we acknowledge death as part of life. So I think that's how it can help the mourner to sort of normalize death, because no one is getting out of here alive, right? We know this, right? We are all going to go. I mean, it's unfortunate that some of us have to go in particular ways, right? And this is part of what we're discussing, but I think that elegy in general helps normalize this inevitability. And I think it's especially useful in that way. And I think what I don't know that this addresses your question, viewer, but I also think that, you know, within the context of Black lives, an elegy for someone who has succumbed to white supremacy begs the question of the causes of Black death. You know, and I think that, you know, that's an important question for us to consider. Yeah. So, and take time with.
Yeah. I just wanted to share quickly, one of my students, when we were reading some poems from Revisiting, you know, she said, you know, it's not always about forgiveness. I'm paraphrasing, but, you know, I'm tired of being expected to forgive every time. And I think that's, you know, part of what you're saying, Danielle, right? Is that, like, in sort of dwelling there, it also shifts the narrative of, like, you know, that we're supposed to forgive, move on, you know, let it go. Darlene, do you have thoughts?
With elegy, I find myself, we talked about bearing witness earlier in the conversation, I find myself using elegy to move me from A to B. And I think to that A to B or C or D, but move me from someplace else other than the grief, so that I'm moving forward. Now, where I end up going, I never know when I start writing the elegy, but the power for me is that it allows me not to stay in a space actually, but to move somewhere else. And I usually don't know what direction I'm going in, but the power is that, like, if we think about it as a kinetic thing, something that is actually moving and has energy, the elegy has that kind of energy for me. And hopefully, I suppose I don't necessarily write this way, but hopefully, because once something goes out into the world and it gets published and so forth, and someone else reads it, they're able to move from some place where they were, so to move to someplace different than where they were when they began reading whatever it is that I write and put out there. But yeah, the most significant power it has is to actually move me from one space in my brain to someplace else.
That's really powerful. And I could really feel that in that elegy for Tiffany in particular. Yeah, that energy. Well, I think it probably is a good time to thank everybody for joining us, and thank all of you so much for this conversation, which was incredibly rewarding. And I want to also note that, you know, we're doing this work there with so many other poets and essayists and so many other thinkers and writers out there who aren't included in Revisiting the Elegy in the Black Lives Matter era, but are just in conversation with us. And this is a very collaborative, you know, communal kind of work. And we want to highlight some of those. Amanda, I don't know if you can share that slide. Fantastic. And I'm going to put in the chat our website and the particular tab that is in conversation with our resources. And we've kind of highlighted some of these here. You know, a place to order the book. You can go to our website for that. We should note that all of the royalties from this book go to the Say Her Name campaign, launched by the African American Policy Forum and Kimberly Crenshaw, who we are indebted to as well for all of her incredible work. You can order the book from the Lesley University website. Again, here's a link to our website which has resources there. And then we've just kind of showcase some of those here for you, thinking more about the Black Lives Matter movement and the incredible archive by Black Poets Speak Out that you can access on Tumblr. The Cultural Front, Howard Ramsey, and his work in bringing Black poetry and Black poetics to the forefront of thought, American thought. And there's a lot of anti-racism syllabi on this website too that I should note I built with my students. And so there's more resources there too. There's a lot on our website, so please check that out and use it in your own educational spaces or in your own activist and personal lives. I have to say that we have a question, really just a comment in the Q&A from one of our contributors, Anne Rashid, who's just thanking us and so grateful for the good work and all you're doing with this wonderful anthology. So thanks so much, Anne, for being here and for everybody. I'm going to turn it over to Kristen from the Boston Public Library so that she can tell you about some upcoming events. But thanks so much to our readers and thanks to everybody for joining us. Much love and good night.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Darlene, Sequoia, Emily, and Danielle for sharing your poetry and your conversation with us this evening. The link to buy the book is in the chat, so I won't say that again. Please keep an eye out for a wide range of programs from the Boston Public Library in 2021. There'll be more about that very soon. In the meantime, we have 2 upcoming talks hosted by BPL President David Leonard on December 3rd. We have NPR journalist Adam Davidson, and on December 9th, historian Neil Gabler with his biography on Ted Kennedy. Thank you so much for joining us for this enriching and engaging and insightful conversation. Be well and good night.